Morning. It is October the 1st, 2025. This is our Utah Safety Council Start with Safety. Wanted to point out the beginning of our new rebrand of the Safety Council. Here we have our new logo, which will not entirely replace the logo. The other logo still is near and dear to our hearts and still lives and breathes on our website. But as we continue into October and the upcoming months, we'll slowly rebrand into this new logo. So I hope you'll like it. If you don't, that's okay too. So, but everybody seems to love it. Okay, October is our favorite month here at the Utah Safety Council. In 2 days, up at the Weber State University Davis campus, we'll be having our annual meeting and award ceremony. This will be the first time that we'll have our award ceremony in October. It kind of fits in better in the safety industry and with the Utah Safety Council calendar to have it in October. And so we think you're going to enjoy it. We have 95 awards to give away in 10 categories. So we hope you can join us. If you have not registered for that event, there's still seats available. Not very many though, but you can still reserve a seat. If you call us or go to our website, probably the best way, at the utahsafetycouncil.org. Again, that's 2 days' time in Layton at the Weber State University Davis campus. The following week, October 8th, 9th, and 10th, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, we will be up at the University of Utah at the Union Building for, oh geez, what is it? It's like the 42nd annual Utah Conference on Safety and Industrial Hygiene. This is our partnership with Weber State, the University of Utah, ROMCO, Mount Wazosha, the American Industrial Hygiene Association, the American Society of Safety Professionals. We all work together to produce this conference. And this year, next week is going to be the biggest and best conference ever. So you can also register for that. You can visit our website, which will take you to a link to register for that. There's about 50 slots left in that conference. So again, visit us at utahsafetycouncil.org. October is a busy month. It seems like it's the month that everybody needs a driving certificate or their MSHA certificate renewed or their first aid CPR AED certificate renewed or forklift training renewed. So we're busy as ever here in Sandy, Utah Safety Council. So it's a good month to register for those things. So visit our website again. We got classes filling up as we move into the fall season. And we're ready for some sweater weather, some flannel weather, as we like to say here at the Utah Safety Council. Talking about October, we will be closed for the holiday on Monday, October 13th. And then on Halloween, October 31st, we'll be working from home, answering phone calls and emails. But at the same time, we're going to watch our little ones march through the Halloween parade at school. So have a safe and awesome October. I'm going to have Fabiana, our business development and marketing person, come up and tell you some more great things happening at the Utah Safety Council. I'm going to take my pen.
All righty, thank you, John. My name is Fabiana, and like John mentioned, I'm the marketing and business development manager here at the Utah Safety Council. And we have some news for the Women in Safety Social Hour. Next week is going to be the same conference that John was mentioning at the 42nd annual Utah Conference on Safety and Industrial Hygiene. It's going to be on October the 9th at 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. We're going to have some food there. So please join us after all your sessions. We're going to be there. And look for more information. We're going to be posting about it. And next we will have, thank you. We have some news for you guys. We participate in different type of conference. John went to Colorado, Denver to participate for the NSC Safety Congress Expo. So he was there. He said it was amazing, had a good time. And so we have Taylor and Karen and Yvette participating in different conferences as well. Let's see, next we will have, we have some activity that we did this last Saturday. We were at the, sorry, I forgot
Head
the,
Start.
the
Head Start. car seat
Head
event.
Start, there we go, sorry. We were impacting the community. We installed some car seats, and we have a lot of people coming in and checking if their car seats were correct installed, and if they needed new car seat, we were there and participated with them. And next we will hear from Yvette, and she has some news as well. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. I just wanted to touch up on our member benefits. We just want to remind you what is included. In addition to that car seat event, we also have car seats. Techs here at the Utah Safety Council, this is a free service that we provide to the public. It's not just a member benefit. So if you're not a member and you think you need to get your car seat checked, or if you know someone, feel free to reach out to us. This is a free service that we do provide to the public. And so membership, I just want to remind you of what your membership benefits are. You do have access to our safety videos on Streamery. If you don't know how to access that and you think you are a member, reach out to us and we can help you get access to that and walk you through on how to use that. In addition, we have free OSHA and first aid CPR and AED training. Depending on your level, you get 1 or 2 per year. We also offer complimentary consultations. We have professionals that will come to your company and just do consultations on what is needed. Discounts on most trainings and products, and company promotion on our platforms. This includes, coming to our fairs, being invited to events, webinars, and our social media platforms. So yeah, if you guys have questions, feel free to reach out. There is a barcode on there. If you can scan that, that will take you directly to our website. But I'm excited. If you want to be a member, call us. Next, we will hear from Karen.
Thank you, Yvette. I have the honor of introducing our guest speaker today, but before I introduce him, I just wanted to make a quick announcement to our listeners, both online and here, to please use the chat box in for any questions you may have. You can text us your questions, or you can raise your hand in the chat box while the presentation is going on. But without further ado, our guest speaker comes to us today as none other than our famous, and I love this guy. He is a mentor to all of us here at Utah Safety Council. His name is Kevin Robison. He is a retired safety and health professional with more than 35 years of experience in industry and consulting. He holds an undergraduate degree and a master's degree in occupational safety and health and environmental management. He is also a board certified safety professional in comprehensive practice. Kevin serves as a National Safety Council instructor and provides regular safety, health, and health training through our Utah Safety Council Advanced Safety Certificate Program. Kevin and his wife, Sherry, they reside in Holiday, Utah. Please welcome Kevin Robison.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Karen, for that introduction. I don't consider myself famous, but I just have a great passion for safety. So thank you. It's great to be with you today. I was asked to take a few moments, just start with safety and actually talk about respiratory protection and the requirements around respiratory protection. This time of year in many of our organizations, we start to see people have issues sometimes with respiratory illnesses and similar things, and sometimes they link those to potential exposures in the work environment. And so many times this topic actually comes up and is one that is discussed this time of the year. So it was felt that this would be a good time just to refresh ourselves on the requirements of the OSHA respiratory protection requirements. So what we're going to do in our short discussion here is we're going to talk about what that OSHA respiratory protection program should look like. We'll talk about different types of respirators and elements of that respiratory protection program, everything from medical evaluations to using the respirators to training the employees and some of those specific requirements that OSHA has for individuals that actually use respirators. So I've broken our discussion today down into 10 different elements of things that you should consider as you look at having a respiratory protection program that meets the requirements that OSHA asks us to do. Now, these requirements are found in 1910.134 of the General Industry Standards, and you can find all of the information that we'll be discussing there today, and hopefully that will be beneficial for you. So one of the first things that OSHA actually outlines is if you're going to have a respiratory protection program, there needs to be someone in charge and someone that has knowledge of the respiratory hazards and the issues related to those hazards. And so they need to have some experience with respiratory hazards, whether it's dust, whether it's vapors, whether it's mist, whatever the exposure or potential exposure is, that individual needs to have knowledge about that. They must be qualified. They also need to be familiar with the different types of respiratory protection that are out there that can be used to protect individuals from those exposures. And so sometimes to get up to speed with this, someone really kind of needs to do a deep dive into specific hazards that they're dealing with and make sure that they understand the protective devices that are available to protect an individual from an airborne exposure. Okay, so one of the first things, and this is something that people sometimes miss, and it's a big deal. And I remember early on in my career, this element wasn't in place. And I remember having some experiences with individuals that had to wear respirators that actually shouldn't have been wearing respirators because of a medical condition. And so this is something that OSHA added later on. And they require that if you're going to have an individual that's going to wear a respirator, they need to be medically qualified to wear that. At the end of the day, it's important to understand that wearing a respirator places a physiological burden on the body, okay? And that burden will vary depending on the healthy condition of the user, the environment in which the individual is working, and the conditions under which they're working. So we take a firefighter that's using a self-contained breathing apparatus in a fire environment. They're under very high stress environment, high pressure, some very serious heat exposures. And all those things really place an incredible physiological burden on the body. And so that's why that medical evaluation needs to be completed. And obviously the medical status of the employee is a significant factor in that. So when we look at some of the physiological effects that happen as we wear a respirator, probably the biggest one is it affects our ability to breathe. And I've had people tell me that when they don that respirator, that they feel like they have a decreased ability to breathe. That they feel like, well, I can't breathe in this thing. I can't get enough air. And so there is an actually physiological effect as you don that respirator that you'll feel an impact to your pulmonary respiratory system. Also, it causes your body to work harder, so your heart rate's going to raise, okay? And for someone that's at risk to a heart condition, that may not be the best thing to put them in a respirator because you'll complicate that or exacerbate that. Body temperature also can rise. Senses can be diminished, okay, as associated with wearing a respirator. And just the psychological, putting on a respirator, I've had more than one person tell me that when I don that respirator, I feel like I'm in a confined space and I feel a little claustrophobic. And so some people have that psychological impact or potential impact from wearing respiratory protection. So what the medical evaluation does is it establishes the medical condition of the wearer, okay? You need to make sure that their body can handle the stress that wearing a respirator puts on their body. So that's done prior to using the respirator. So if we have a hazard in the workplace, okay, we'll just put them in a respirator. No, you need to actually have them medically cleared before you put them in that respirator by getting a medical evaluation done. It also needs to be done prior to fit testing and training. It should be done by a physician or someone else that helps some other healthcare professional that has experience doing that. And that medical evaluation should follow the questionnaire that's found in Appendix C of the OSHA standard under 1910.134. Okay, there's an actual questionnaire that the individual will complete that will give the medical provider more information about their medical history and their condition. Okay, also an initial medical evaluation can also dictate requirements that the user may be able to use a respirator or not, just based on a pure medical evaluation. Okay, so a follow-up medical evaluation is required if there's a positive response to any of the questions 1 through 8 in that Appendix C, okay? There's a positive question, then there needs to be a follow-up exam. And if their initial medical exam identifies a need to follow up, then that needs to be done. So a common example of a follow-up medical exam is that the healthcare provider will have the user complete what's called a pulmonary function test. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever had this done or completed a pulmonary function test, but it's quite intimidating because they have you blow into a tube and they have you blow, and the individual that's administering the test will have you blow until you feel like almost that you're going to pass out. And what they're measuring is your forced, or your what they call forced vital capacity, your ability to breathe, and really what your lungs can handle and how well your cardiovascular system works, because that's important when it comes to wearing a respirator. Okay, so that medical evaluation is super important. Okay, and needs to be completed and well documented. In my professional experience, I've had people that have not passed that medical evaluation because it would put them at risk of a medical condition if they donned a respirator. So be cautious and be careful about just putting a respirator on somebody. And sometimes people will dismiss that, but it actually can place a significant burden on the body, depending on the type of respirator that the individual would use. Okay, so next we need to evaluate the hazards that we're trying to protect the employee from. So we need to identify the contaminants and evaluate those and what is the level of risk to our employees. Okay, we need to understand what are the physical properties of these contaminants? Are they a dust? Are they a gas? Are they a vapor? Are they a mist? Are they a fume? And it's only by understanding those physical properties can we be assured that we provide the right respiratory protection. Because if we don't, we can actually put them in a respirator that actually compounds their ability to breathe, and the respirator would not function as intended. So understanding those physical properties is really important. We also need to make sure that we understand, and this is a key issue. If you have potential oxygen deficient environments, you need to make sure that you understand those. And there is no respirator other than a supplied air respirator that will protect an individual. And we'll get into this in a minute in an oxygen deficient environment. And we'll define that in just a minute. So oxygen deficiency is a big deal. Okay, we need to estimate the employee's exposure to these hazards. And this can be done through monitoring. So we could actually monitor a gas or a vapor or a dust particulate. And as we evaluate that, we can measure what is the level. And the importance of that is we understand what the level is, then we can make the determination. Does the employee need to wear respiratory protection or not to comply with the standard?
Good question, Kevin.
Yes.
When it comes to, for example, an occasional exposure, let's say you're an outdoor worker who occasionally gets exposed to wildfire smoke.
Okay.
Is there a certain amount of exposures that would need to happen to qualify for something to have some type of respiratory protection? Or is that just considered well, it's just a very occasional thing. It doesn't happen often. It's not covered.
Yeah, the frequency of exposure has no bearing on this. If they are going to be exposed, then Taylor, they need to make sure that they are qualified to wear that respirator. Okay, and I'll talk about another example of this in just a minute. But regardless of the exposure, if it's once a year that the employee has the exposure, they need to go through this whole process. Okay, because really at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is protect the individual against the hazard. Okay, and there are some materials that if they weren't protected, it could be life-threatening. Okay, now if we do not know, or we haven't measured, or we haven't estimated what the employee exposure is to the hazards, OSHA asks us to assume IDLH. What that means, that's immediately dangerous to life and health. So if we have an IDLH condition, then it kind of changes things. And so it's really important in your assessment of your workplace, try to get a good understanding of what is the level of the contaminant in the workplace. That will help you not only best protect the employee, but also if the employee doesn't need to have a respirator to wear because the contaminant level is so low, your employee will probably appreciate that, because most employees, it's not their favorite thing to do to don a respirator. Okay. Okay, so that said, make sure you understand what the exposures are. So now let's talk about some of the hazards that require respirator use. Okay. Probably one of the most significant ones is an oxygen deficient environment. And that means any environment where we have less than 19.5% oxygen. Okay, good examples of that are confined spaces. Okay, anything that's a confined space, something like a silo, a boiler, a tank, a sewer line, underground, anything that where there's a potential contaminant that could be present that could displace the oxygen. So I'll give you an example of an environment. There was an employee that was working in a utility hole, and they were doing some work, and upstream, they were in this utility hole upstream from it. They were trying to purge the line that the employee was working on, and they were using nitrogen gas. Now, the nitrogen gas came down the line. There was a leak in the line, so the nitrogen leaked into the utility hole where the employee was working. The nitrogen displaced the oxygen, and the employee passed out because it was an oxygen deficient condition. And so you have to be really careful and understand, again, the hazards that your employees are exposed to, because it can create an oxygen deficient condition. Okay. Now, if we have an environment that's immediately dangerous to life and health, that's an IDLH, or an unknown atmosphere, that requires a respirator. So let me give you an example of a contaminant that's IDLH. That would be hydrogen sulfide gas. Okay, some of you have smelled that rotten odor egg smell before. It's characteristic around refineries and wherever you perhaps produce crude oil. It's very common in that industry. And that at high concentrations can cause immediate death. And so in those types of environments, it's important that those types of materials, that respiratory protection is provided to protect the employee from that IDLH condition. Okay, and so supplied air respiratory protection is required in both of these conditions, oxygen deficient environments and IDLH environments. So what that means is they actually have to have an air source that is supplied to them, either via a hose line or an actually self-contained device on their back that provides oxygen for a limited time period, similar to what a firefighter would wear. Other examples of hazards requiring respirators are chemical hazards. This is one that we would be all familiar with. That's overexposure to any type of contaminant, such as a dust, a fume, a gas, a vapor, okay, smoke. And so these can be in sufficient quantities that the individual could be overexposed to them based on an OSHA compliance standard. And then we have biological hazards. These are things where there's exposure to organisms such as bacteria, viruses. You know, we all recently, or not recently, a few years back, we went through a big issue with this with H1N1 and that biological issue. And a lot of people, they became very familiar with respiratory protection to protect them against the spread of that virus. And so biological hazards is one that for years, we really didn't give it a lot of concern because we didn't have that many biological agents. But as our society has grown and progressed, we've seen more of these biological hazards introduced. So when we can look at controlling these respiratory hazards to an acceptable level to protect the health of our employees, there's what we call a hierarchy of controls. And that's where we want to try to control that hazard to protect the employee. And our first choice is always to use what we call engineering controls. If we can engineer the hazard out, that is the best way possible. Example of that would be using ventilation to capture that particulate, capture that vapor, okay? Or just a process change to where we eliminate the production of an airborne substance, whether it's a dust, whether it's a gas or a vapor, okay? Second, we can't engineer out the hazard, then we'll use administrative controls. That's everything from rotating employees to reduce exposure time, to limiting time someone that can work in that area, to changing the way the work is done to, again, limit the exposure. And then lastly, our choice is actually to provide personal protective equipment, namely respiratory protection equipment. And that's generally the last choice, and that's used when we're unable to eliminate the hazard or reduce the hazard to a level that not only reduces the risk to the employee, but also complies with a specific OSHA standard. So what is a respirator? It's a device that protects workers by purifying the air or by providing an air supply, such as oxygen, in an IDLH condition. So there are two main types of respirators. There are air purifying respirators. And those are those that remove the contaminant from the breathing air through a filter, a cartridge, or a canister. Okay, those are probably the most common types. Or we have supplied air respirators that actually provide clean air from an uncontaminated source, such as a bottle and or a compressor. So we have those two main types of respirators. Let's talk about those. When we go to select the respirator, we want to make sure we select the appropriate respirator based on the hazard, the workplace, and the user conditions and their ability. Okay, the NIOSH, which stands for National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, they actually certify respirators to make sure that they will perform at certain levels. So it's important that you use respiratory protection that is NIOSH certified, okay? That it's got that NIOSH stamp on it, that has been evaluated and tested and will meet certain criteria to protect the employee. Now, as we begin to look at the different types of respiratory protection, there are multiple types available. Okay, so it's important to, when you begin down this road, to look at, number one, identify the hazard, understand the hazard, and decide which is going to be best for our employees' exposure. Okay, and it's just a choice you'll have to make. Now, if we're using a supplied air breathing system, there's a couple other things that need to be made apparent. If you're using a compressor to provide the supplied air, and that compressor is an oil lubricated compressor, you're required to have a CO, that means carbon monoxide alarm, and a high temperature alarm on the breathing air that's being produced. Okay? If you only have a high temperature alarm on that compressor, then you must monitor for carbon monoxide at intervals to make sure that that carbon monoxide is not being introduced into the breathing air. I've actually seen this happen where an individual was on a supplied air source provided by a compressor. It was producing carbon monoxide and it overexposed the employee to the carbon monoxide, and they started getting disoriented and had to pull them out of that environment. And they weren't monitoring for carbon monoxide. And when investigation was conducted, realized that, oh wow, we had CO in the air source that was being provided. And so if you're using oil lubricated compressor, make sure you do those two things. If it's non-oil lubricated compressor, you just have to make sure that the carbon monoxide level is less than 10 parts per million. Okay, that's considered a safe level, and you can just make sure that that's measured and tested periodically. Okay. The other thing is if you're using a supplied air system, believe it or not, this has happened before. Say like in a production environment where they're using other gases, things like nitrogen or 100% oxygen or something like that in their operation. It's important to make sure that the couplings that are used to connect the breathing air are not the same as connections that would be made to 100% oxygen or nitrogen or any other gas that's utilized in the environment, because that could create a very complicated and very serious condition if the employee was exposed to those high levels. Okay, so let's talk about air purifying respirators. There's 3 different classifications. And again, you'll find this in 1910.134. There's filtering face pieces. Okay, this is one that we're probably all familiar with. We have half mask respirators. These are used with cartridges. You can see in our diagram there, the cartridge on that particular half mask is a combination cartridge. So in other words, it filters out 2 different elements. Okay. And then we have full face respirators. And again, they provide not only respiratory protection, but they also provide facial protection. So if maybe the contaminant was an irritant to the eyes, then we would want to provide a full face respirator to not only protect the individual from breathing the contaminant, but also the irritation to the eyes from the exposure. Okay. So we're going to talk about each one of these now. The first one, the filtering face piece, many times we just call this a dust mask. Okay. We've all seen these during the pandemic that we had a few years back. These became very popular. Okay. In fact, so popular that you had a hard time finding them. There was actually a shortage of them. And in companies and businesses that were looking, and even individuals trying to find these for protection, you couldn't get them. And so this is a very popular respirator. And again, it's called a filtering face piece. It operates on a negative pressure in that it covers the majority of the face, and it's just composed of a filtering media. Okay. That media will change depending on the efficiency of the respirator. The filters are labeled with an N, P, or R. Now, the N just basically stands for that respirator cannot be used in an oil mist type environment. So if there's an oily mist present, that respirator cannot be used. If it's an R environment, there can be some exposure to an oil mist. And a P means that respirator can be used in an oil mist environment. So a common one that we see, and we saw during the pandemic, was N95 respirators. And what that number represents is the efficiency at which it removes the contaminant. So 95% of the contaminant on an N95 respirator, it would remove 95% of the contaminants. Okay, it does not protect against gases or vapors. It's just particulates. Okay. Now, these filtering face pieces, in most cases, these are disposable respirators. So they're not designed to be used repeated multiple times, where many of our other respirators are designed to be used multiple times over a period of time. Many times these filtering face pieces get loaded with dust. If you've ever worn one in a dusty environment, like you clean out your garage and you put on a dust respirator and you take it off, you look at it and well, wow, I'm glad I wore that because that protects me. That protected me from all that dust going into my lungs. Okay. And so basically one of the primary indicators that this is met its life is when it becomes difficult to breathe with that respirator on, you probably need to change it out. Okay, now let's look at the full face piece respirators and the half masks. These are respirators that protect the individual with the cartridge. Okay, they can be used in atmospheres that contain both particulates and gases or vapors. Okay, and so whereas the previous respirator that we looked at, this is only good for filtering dust. Okay, aerosols or fumes, particulates. That's what we're primarily protecting against. Whereas these respirators, the full face and the half mask, can provide protection against multiple contaminants. Everything from carbon monoxide to ammonia to acid gases to organic vapors. They can cover a wide gamut of protective factors. Okay, but here's the thing we need to understand. These respirators are not to be used in oxygen deficient environments. And I actually was involved in a case where an employer had an employee go into a confined space, and the employee kind of pushed back and he says, no, wear your respirator will protect you. And it was an oxygen deficient environment. The employee went in and the employee died. Okay, these respirators will not protect you in an oxygen deficient environment. Okay. The other thing is these respirators have a life. And we'll talk about that in a second. Many times with these respirators, breathing becomes difficult because of the additional effort required to draw the air through the respirator. So if you remember earlier, I talked about how sometimes people feel like they're suffocating or they can't get enough air. When we breathe through, and the air has to go through those cartridges, that's what creates that negative pressure. And many people have a hard time pulling that air. And after you load the cartridges up with contaminants, it even gets even more difficult to breathe. And so you kind of get that claustrophobia feeling like I can't get enough air. And that's kind of one of the signs that tells the employer, okay, you need to change your cartridges out because you've loaded up your cartridges with the contaminants. Okay. Now with the full face, as I said, these come with a variety of different types of protections. The organic vapor cartridges, they do not protect against particulates, but they will protect against organic vapors. So it's important when we go all the way back to our beginning of our discussion, we talked about how the importance of knowing the hazards that you're protecting the employee from. If I put an individual in an environment with this respirator and there's particulates, it will plug that respirator up and make it ineffective, and the employee will go, hey, I can't breathe. And so again, it's important to you understand the environment and that you understand the exposure. Okay. These cartridges are what we call chemical filters, and they have specific compounds within those cartridges that remove the gases and or vapors. And the life of those filters depends on the amount of exposure, the concentration of the exposure, and the exposure time. So those are all important things to remember. Now let's talk about powered air purifying respirator. That's commonly referred to as a PAPR. Okay, and that's an air purifying respirator. Again, primarily full face, but I've seen some half masks that with a blower force the air into the respirator to provide to the employee to breathe. It can be a full face, it can be a half mask, or it can actually be a helmet hood. So if you've ever seen someone sandblasting before, and many times they'll have a hood on, they'll have a hose coming out the back. And what that hose is, it's providing air into the hood, and it's positive, and so it's creating a positive pressure, doesn't allow dust to come into the hood. It blows the dust or blows the air out so the dust can't come up into the hood because they're sandblasting. And it protects the individual against that dust exposure. Whereas if they put them in a respirator in that environment, that dust respirator would be loaded up very quickly with all the dust, and the individual would have a very difficult time breathing. So these powered air purifying respirators are very popular and common. One of the restrictions or one of the drawbacks to this respirator, it has a shorter battery life. Okay, and so this is not really designed, unless you've got an ultra strong battery, it's not designed for a long period of time. Okay, and again, this cannot be used in oxygen deficient or IDLH atmospheres, the PAPR. Okay, so many times what this is, the individual will wear a little belt around their waist. It's got the battery pack and the little fan device. It's in the back. Hose comes up the back, introduces into the hood, and there you go. We have a PAPR. Now, the cartridge and canister life, the conditions that affect the service life are based on a couple of things. Now, how hard the person is breathing. If I'm really pumping a lot of air through that cartridge because I'm breathing hard, the life of my canister or cartridge can actually go down pretty quick because I'm using that medium. So let's say I have an organic vapor cartridge and I'm breathing and I'm in an environment that has vapors. Okay, if I'm really working really hard and I'm breathing really fast, I'm going to pull a lot more air through that cartridge, and subsequently its life is going to be less. Okay, temperature will also affect it, humidity, and just if you've got multiple component elements present. Okay, so all these cartridges, filters, canisters, again, just a reminder, they need to be NIOSH approved. They're color coded. You can actually go out and look online. So there should be no question when you look at the color, what that's filtering out. And you can actually go into the OSHA standard and see that color code system. Okay, the label shall not be removed and remains legible so the employee knows he has the right canister or the right cartridge for the exposure. Now, all respirators have something called an assigned protection factor, an APF. And what that is that tells you what the level of respiratory protection that the respirator or class of respirators is expected to provide to the employee. Now, NIOSH establishes those. They've created this table. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through this, but different types of respirators have higher or lower assigned protection factors. So you can see a quarter mask there from an air purifying has a lower protection factor than, say, a full face respirator does. Okay, and this is in the standard. So there's also something in the standard called the maximum use concentration. That's the maximum amount of atmospheric concentration of a hazardous substance from which an employee can be expected to be protected when wearing a respirator, and is determined by the assigned protection factor of the respirator class and the exposure limit of the hazardous substance. Okay, so basically what this is helping us do, make sure we don't put an individual in an environment with a respirator that the respiratory protection is not going to protect them for the total exposure time. Okay, if there is no OSHA exposure limit for a hazardous material they're being exposed to, the employer must determine the maximum use concentration on the basis of the available information on that material or professional judgment from like an industrial hygienist. This is how we calculate that MUC. It can be determined mathematically by multiplying the assigned protection factor of the respirator by the OSHA permissible exposure limit and short-term exposure limit and or ceiling limit. So if the substance doesn't have a PEL permissible exposure limit or a short-term exposure limit or ceiling level standard, you also could refer to the TLV values, the threshold limit values that are produced by the Industrial Hygiene Association, okay? And use that also to determine that maximum use concentration. Now, OSHA also requires that training be provided to the user of the respirator before use, and also that training be done refreshed annually on the respirator, so the employee understands what are the conditions of the respirator. And with that, also, if there's any changes in the workplace that would affect the performance of the respirator, the employee needs to understand that and they need to be updated. If the employee use of the respirator demonstrates that they're making mistakes using the respirator or it's not donned correctly, then that should tell the employer that the training's been inadequate and the employee needs to be retrained. Okay, so any condition that indicates that the respirator is not being used correctly, then the employee should be trained. Also, the employee needs to understand why the respirator is necessary, how to properly fit the respirator, and the required maintenance on that respirator to ensure it performing at the way it was designed. Also, the individual needs to understand the limitations. So, for example, a user of a half mask respirator should know and understand you cannot use this in an oxygen deficient environment. It will not protect you. Also to understand, okay, this respirator has black cartridges. That's for use in an organic vapor type exposure, not a particulate exposure like a dusty environment. So also the employee needs to understand how to use the respirator in emergencies. Now, some respiratory equipment is just that. It's an emergency rescue device. So if in that case and situation, there are some environments where emergency rescue equipment has to be provided. So if an emergency comes up, the individual has the ability to exit the environment, put on that emergency rescue equipment, and leave the place. So as a young safety professional, in between my junior and senior year, I had an internship in Wyoming at a company where they processed gas, and we had hydrogen sulfide gas present. And so we had, in the event of an accidental release of hydrogen sulfide gas, because that in high concentrations can be lethal, we placed throughout the facility, and every employee had an emergency rescue respirator with them at the plant. So if something happened, they could immediately don that respirator and get out of the plant if there was an accidental release. And we actually had that happen. We had an accidentally overpressure of a vessel. We had a huge release of hydrogen sulfide gas. Everybody donned their emergency equipment and they got to a safe area, so they were not seriously impacted by that exposure. So some respirators, even if it's a respirator used in an emergency condition, they need to be trained on how to use that. Okay. Okay, what the training consists of is how to inspect, how to put the respirator on, how to perform the seal checks, how to maintain the respirator, and even more importantly, how to recognize medical signs and symptoms, of overexposure, and to ensure that the respirator is working correctly.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
Say you have a gas or something that's colorless and odorless. What kind of physical symptoms should someone watch out for? Would it be like deliriousness?
That's going to be dependent. That's going to be dependent on the gas itself. So that's a good question, Taylor. Let me give you a good example of that. Carbon monoxide is a colorless, it's an odorless gas. Okay, we can't smell it. But what some of the early signs of exposure are is if someone's exposed to carbon monoxide, sometimes they'll feel a little bit nauseous, or they'll get a headache. And so that's part of the training that goes on with respiratory protection, that the employer train the employee, if you're overexposed to this, this is what you're going to feel, okay? So I had an example of that in my career with a couple of employees that were working in a utility hole one day, and they were working in an environment, it was ventilated, but I'll make a long story short, they were being exposed to carbon monoxide, and they started to get nauseous. And one guy says, oh man, I feel like I'm gonna throw up. And they were smart because they recognized that, oh wow, this is not right. And so they got out of the space and fixed what was wrong, and they were able to go back in and complete their work. But because they knew and understood the symptoms of exposure, then they took the appropriate precautions. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so fit testing is required. The fit test is nothing more than to evaluate the fit of the respirator, make sure it fits correctly. It needs to be done before initial use and then annually thereafter. And if there's any change in your facial structures as a result of weight loss, you know, maybe you got dentures or you had some teeth removed, anything that would affect the bone structure of your face where a respirator would fit, then that would additional fit testing would be required. It's important that people know and understand this is a kind of a sore spot, but if employees are required to wear a respirator, they cannot wear glasses. They have to have a respirator designed specifically to hold their glasses. Okay, so there's actually a spectacle kit that will actually go inside the respirator. So you can't wear your glasses and wear, again, that would be a full face respirator, or you could still wear another respirator. Okay, there's two different types of tests. We need to move along here real quick. There's a qualitative fit test. This is just a simple test where we test if the individual can detect a sense of an irritant smoke. So if they don the respirator, we use this irritant smoke, and if you can usually tell real quick if the respirator is working because they don't, but if it is not working correctly, they start coughing because it's an irritant. Very easy test to do. They also have a quantitative test that actually hooks the hose up to the respirator and really measures the amount of leakage out of the respirator when it's donned. This is what most people do today, is they do these quantitative fit tests. Okay. Okay, I'm just going to quickly go through. OSHA requires the respirators be maintained clean and sanitary and good working order. That's pretty straightforward. And then depending on their uses will dictate how often those are cleaned. You can see the information here. If it's exclusively used by just one employee, then that individual will just clean it and sanitize it as necessary to maintain it in that sanitary condition. If it's shared by employees, it needs to be done after each use. And for emergency use, and obviously would need to be done after use. And if it's used for training and testing, it's between training sessions. And again, they just need to be stored correctly, protected from the elements that could compromise the integrity of the filter media. And these are some of the things we checked and inspect to make sure that the respirator is going to work as designed. Believe it or not, emergency respirators are required to be inspected monthly, and that inspection needs to be documented. Repairs need to be made by persons that have the training and knowledge to do that. And as we use the respirators, we always put them on in a clean environment. We always check the seal first to make sure a proper fit. And there's a negative pressure test and a test and a positive pressure test. You can see those demonstrated here in the two pictures. And as the individual wears the respirator, you need to make sure it protects around your nose and your mouth and make sure that's tight. Okay, if that tight fit can't be maintained, then you shouldn't go into the contaminated area. And again, facial hair is not allowed when wearing a tight fitting respirator. Okay, so that's important. And then we talked about glasses already. Okay, while using the respirator, you smell or taste something that's out of the ordinary or the contaminant of concern, then you need to make sure that you leave. If your eyes or throat become irritated, if you observe a change in your breathing, if there's some kind of alarm that's indicating a condition, you need to get out. Now, OSHA requires that your respiratory protection program be reviewed annually. And just to make sure that everything is working as intended, this is a really important element. Because it's one thing to have a program in place, but obviously things will always change in the environment with employees. And that's why OSHA requires that this annual evaluation be done. Is our respiratory protection program working as required and intended to protect our employees from the hazard? And that's to be documented. Your OSHA respiratory protection needs to be a written program. Obviously, the medical evaluations need to be maintained. The fit test records need to be maintained. And those emergency use respirators inspections also need to be maintained. Here are some of the things that need to be present in your written program, all the things we've talked about. And it needs to be specific. This is not a very vanilla stuff. This is stuff that is specific to your work site. It specifically identifies the contaminants the employees are exposed to. Now, lastly, I just want to talk about voluntary use. There are times in the work environment where an employee can be exposed to a contaminant that does not exceed an OSHA standard. So in other words, what that means is under the specifics of the OSHA law, an employee can go into that contaminated environment and can work without any respiratory protection because they've documented and shown that they're meet or they're below the regulatory standard. Some people don't want to take that risk, even though the company indicates that it's safe. And so for voluntary use respirators, the employer needs to determine that voluntary use is okay and is appropriate. And what that means is if someone wants to use a respirator, they can. Now, they need to make sure that they choose the right respirator, and that will not create a hazard. In the OSHA standard, there's an Appendix D that you're required to provide employees that want to use a respirator, even though it's not required. And if it's a face filtering piece, like a dust mask, the employer must establish and implement a program to address medical evaluations and training on that material if needs be. Now, in some cases, you're not required to do the medical evaluations and fit testing, and I'm not going to go into that right now. That's a whole nother topic, okay? But here are all the references to the OSHA standard. You can go to 1910.134. You can find all this information, and hopefully, through our discussion today, you've learned that the need for a written respiratory protection program, the selection of different types of respirators available, the importance of medical evaluations, the importance of use and maintaining those correctly, the significance of training the employees and doing that annual evaluation and keeping the records as required. Okay, there's also a guidance document out there. If you want to look at, it will summarize pretty much all the information that I've covered today. It's just OSHA respiratory requirements. You can Google that and the document will come up. It's a 5-page document. And if you would like a copy of that, you can email me here at this address and I'd be happy to provide you a copy of that. But it summarizes pretty much everything that I've covered today. So thank you all for your participation and attention attending today. I hope this information has been helpful. And we look forward to seeing you in another Start With Safety, and have a safe day.
Thank you so much to our guest speaker of honor today, Kevin Robison. I learned so much more about respiratory everything today. Thank you so much, sir. With that being said, please join us next month for our next Start With Safety on November 5th, same time at 10. We are going to discuss National Child Safety and Protection Month. We have special guests from the Highway Safety Office, and we look forward to seeing you there. Stay safe. Question about the beard,
Yes.
and the respiratory mask.
Yes.
So let's say they